Welcome to episode 118 of Silver Lining for Learning. I'm very excited about this episode because we're going to be talking about Sesame Workshop and its history, the ways in which it has adjusted to and increased its impact during the pandemic. And not only are we going to be celebrating the accomplishments of Sesame Workshop, but we're also going to ask some questions about this as a model. Because, of course, there are many people worldwide who may want to use media to influence the lives of children. And this is the most successful example of its kind. In fact, the single greatest accomplishment of the Harvard Graduate School of Education was its participation in Sesame Street. And my colleague Jill Blatt, who I'm going to introduce now to be sort of the MC for this episode, was present at the inception and involved in the very early days of Sesame Street. Joe has been a wonderful colleague during the 22 years that I've been at Harvard. He has led our academic program in technology and just been fabulous. And his course on children and media is something that our students are very excited about and for which he justly received the Ed School's Teaching Award. So I'm very happy to have Joe here tonight, and he will introduce our guests from Sesame Workshop.
Thank you, Chris, and I must say it's a real honor to be here. Any YouTube series that manages to get to 118 episodes is obviously doing something right. And having enjoyed watching you and Zhao and Punya and Kurt enjoy and explore with lots of other people, I really feel great to be here, and especially great to be accompanied and by two friends, colleagues, people I really respect from Sesame Workshop. One is Kim Foulds, who is the Vice President for Research at Sesame. And as you'll, I think if there's a single point you take away from this hour, it will be how fundamental research and evaluation are to everything that Sesame does and to its success. So Kim's leadership in that role is really extraordinary, but I'll let her tell you more about how it works. And we also have with us Shanna Kohn, who is not only a friend, but a former student. So I couldn't be prouder to have her with us, graduate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who came to the Ed School interested, of course, in international work and in education policy, but not particularly, I think, about media when she arrived. And it was really learning about Sesame that I think ignited Shanna's interest in the field. And now she's a fabulous contributor at the workshop. But some of your viewers might be wondering, well, what's Harvard really got to do with this other than Chris's and my interest? So I thought I would just share very quickly, pointing out that, Harvard celebrated the 50th anniversary of Sesame Street, broadcast in the United States 2 years ago. And here you see Big Bird visiting with president of the university, Larry Bacow. Although, of course, Big Bird, being Big Bird, pronounced his name Bacow, and they had to spend a while getting that straight. But eventually, they managed to hit it off, more or less literally. Here, celebrating, as I said, 50 years. But really, the link goes back to this gentleman, Professor Gerald Lesser, who was the head of the Lab of Human Development at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in the late 1960s, and was recruited by the founders of Sesame Workshop, Joan Gans Cooney and Lloyd Morissette, to be leading the academic curriculum formation of Sesame. And I thought this picture was great for two other reasons. One is you see that Kermit the Frog was there from the very before the beginning. This is part of the planning, and also because the picture is in black and white. And that takes us to the one other point I wanted to make before handing off to our Sesame guests, and that is how hard it is to put your head back into the state of technology and media in 1968. And to think about things like the fact that there were only 3 choices on television, 3 popular networks, that PBS did not yet exist. There were public television stations around the country, but not a public television network. And that the idea of using a medium that had become, had entered everyone's home on the strengths of entertainment and commercials to be an education medium was just totally radical. So when we think today about, does it make sense to try to harness virtual reality or podcasts or anything that's sort of the happening media now for education, I find it quite inspiring to think about the vision that prompted the use of television for Sesame. And one last point, not just for education, but recognizing children as a special audience with special needs. So learning in the formal sense is clearly a central need, but so are social emotional development, understanding the world around you and making commitments to it. And those are things that have also been part of the Sesame curriculum since the beginning. So with that, Kim, let me ask you to sort of start to bite into this question of how Sesame continues to do innovation around research and education.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. So as Joe mentioned, research is really central to how Sesame approaches content creation. And this has been the case since the 60s, since its inception. And that hasn't changed. So much has changed in how children consume media, how we create media, but really research as the heart of Sesame has remained. And what we really follow is what we call the Sesame Workshop model, where at the start of any intervention, season of television, whatever it may be, we start with a needs assessment. And what this makes Sesame particularly unique in the United States, was also globally, particularly with our international humanitarian work, is that before we do anything, we go talk to parents, teachers of young children, and young children themselves. We really want to know, how are they thinking about things? What sort of things do they want to see in their media content? And we ask parents, what makes you happy? What's your favorite thing about being a parent? What are the challenges you face? What are cultural norms that are really important for you? How does that manifest through song, dance, storytelling, those types of things? Then we, of course, get into issues of prioritization around services for their children to help their children develop. That then informs a curriculum and framework, which we work with Shanna, who I'll pass to in just a minute, to really make sure that research and the findings of our research, children's voices, as Joe was just mentioning, are central and really our North Star to everything that we do. From any sort of curriculum framework, this is really where Sesame is unique in this space, and many other children's media companies have adapted these methods, but formative research. And this, even though, as I mentioned, things have changed and research has stayed central, formative research, really getting content in front of kids to understand what they find fun, funny, what they're learning from the content, has remained the same. And that is critical. And I think that is what has made Sesame so unique and important and powerful in this space, because ultimately we support children's development, but the unique thing that research provides is what brings that element of joy, what really makes children and their parents smile when they're watching a television show or reading a storybook or whatever the material is. And then we go through some rounds of content creation, which again, working with Shanna. And then the other innovation that we have is that we're constantly evaluating our work, trying to understand what didn't work, what did work as well as what didn't work. We try to really embrace the spirit of Sesame that Joe was talking about as an experiment, even 52 years later, that we still haven't figured it out. And this is in large part, again, because the way that children consume media has changed so much. The challenges that parents and children are facing have changed so much. So our understanding of what works and what doesn't has to constantly be checked, and our assumptions have to be constantly engaged. And really this becomes cyclical. We never stop. Research is the through line through all of our content creation. And we've had to adapt it in a lot of significant ways for our international work, but ultimately getting content in front of children, evaluating what they're learning, what they're not, is the hallmark, is really the trademark of what we do at Sesame Workshop. And so with that, I will pass to my education colleague, Shanna, who will talk a little bit more about content.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks, Chris, and everyone for having us. Very excited to be here. So Kim did a beautiful overview, as usual, of the Sesame process. And what I'd like to do is just dive in a little bit to that piece of participatory approach and cultural resonance that's so important to what we do. So in my case, when Kim and I are working on an international co-production, that piece of working with local experts is really, in addition to the research, in addition to the conversations she's having, that continued partnership with local experts is really key to the Sesame process. So throwing back to 50 years ago, as Joe did, shortly after 1969, when Sesame Street first launched, the government of Mexico came to our founder and said, we like the show, we'd like to have it dubbed, and we'd like to have it for our children in Spanish. And Joan Ganscuny said, no, we won't do that. But what we will do is create a Sesame Street for Mexico that's locally produced and that's specific to the needs and priorities of children here, in the same way that we did in New York City and the same way we did in the United States. And that was the beginning of this co-production model, where following a needs assessment, this bigger research project that Kim's team carries out, we go in and hold an educational seminar with the academic experts within the country. So academic, as well as practitioners, anyone working with children who really understands the landscape of kids. And we say, here's what we heard from research. Is this correct? What is the priority here for your children? So I'll give an example because I think it's easier to illustrate with something specific. Kim and I work together on Ahlan Simsim, which is our program in the Middle East. And what we heard very clearly after the research was kids need help with social emotional skills. They've suffered great adversity. Their parents have suffered great adversity. And what they need is help with naming and coping with the big feelings that they're having. And then we went on, and Kim and I can talk more about this, to create a show that was in a culturally sensitive manner, addressing emotion recognition and regulation through the lens of what would be appropriate for the Middle East.
Great, Shanna, thank you, and Kim as well. I, of course, also have lots of things I'd like to reflect on to what you said, but I think we'll step back for a second and let Zhao and Punya and Kurt ask their questions.
Thank you, and thank you so much for just giving us the lay of the land here. I'm just curious, this is coming personally because I remember growing up in India, the kinds of stories and stuff I would be reading, like the fables and from various sort of historical, epical stories. And then actually having the sort of double take when my kids started going to elementary school here to see the kinds of stories that they were reading, like thematically, there were these sort of interesting differences in the sense of in India, it was always like, the stories would have this moral, which was collectivist in nature, where, the individual sort of steps back for the good of the whole, or, you get the idea. While here, it was always about like, finding your voice and standing up for yourself. And neither is wrong, right? But it was just interesting to me to see that distinction. I'm wondering, as you work across different countries in different cultural contexts, do these tensions sort of appear, and how does Sesame Street as an organization, because again, you are also culturally rooted in your, own context, how do you navigate those things? Because sometimes those can become, because I can see certain aspects of the kinds of stories I was reading when I was a child as being deeply problematic. Having, let's say, a caste-based or a Brahminical influence and so on, which now in hindsight, I was like, man, that was what crazy story to tell a kid, because it's sending some very strange messages there. And I'm sure you face that. I mean, I'm just curious about how you navigate some of these, or do these tensions pop up, or are we talking about childhood in ways that seem to cross cultural sort of differences and so on? So I was just curious about that.
Shanna, you want to respond?
Sure, I can start. That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. I think that really gets at the core of a lot of what my job and Kim's job is. So I think the way I would answer that is I do think there is a core set of values that make Sesame Sesame. And I would articulate them as the importance of play, the importance of early learning, the importance of equity. I'm sort of on the spot, I'm coming up with the words. And we approach everything through that lens. So if we felt something would do harm, we would really think twice before inserting that cultural norm into our production. That being said, I think it's really important that even the values that we're promoting really be promoted in a way that's sensitive. And there might be some values that, you know, if we promoted them in the way that we would in the US, for example, they may not be accepted and might actually prevent kids from seeing our show because parents would turn it off. So I think that it's a tension we're always struggling with. And I think the reverse is true, what you're saying too, that there's cultural values we're constantly learning from. So as an example, in the Middle East, I'm leading the curriculum on that, but I'm working with a team of advisors from the region. And one of the topics for the season was, or one of the strategies was asking for help. And so I kept thinking, okay, asking for help, ask your mom for help, ask your dad for help, asking for help, very simple. And the advisors said, no, this is asking the community. There wouldn't be a situation where somebody would advise you to ask for help from everyone around you, not just your mom or your dad or your sister. And that was a real wake up moment for me, like, okay, I'm really glad you were here to correct that, because that really wouldn't have been an accurate way to portray that. So it goes both ways, definitely.
Thank you.
And I would add to that, this is really, as Shanna mentioned, this is where we work so closely with the education team, because it's in conjunction with the work with advisors is where my team goes out to speak directly to parents and children and practitioners working with young children. So teachers, but also social workers, child protection officers, the like, because we ground what we do in developmental milestones, and developmental milestones are also culturally contextualized. We know this as well. We ground it in milestones, and then also we often have a parent component to our work where we're providing access to the science of child development to parents. And we hear this over and over again. It's not that I'm against play or against socio-emotional learning. It's you're not explaining to me why. And you need to come to me assuming that you can have this conversation. Because a lot of times there's an assumption, I think, that parents are not doing X, Y, and Z because they don't want to. And it's really, they want the information parents globally want to do what's right by their children. They want to make the best decisions for their children, and they need to have access to that information. And I do think with a lot of our parents facing work, we work to make science accessible, culturally appropriate science accessible, that makes it a nice counter to our child facing content to make that more palatable.
So I have two questions. One is a quick first question, then a deeper question after that, just so the people who watch the show later can learn a bit from you, Shanna and Kim. My department at Indiana University is heavy in formative assessment, but two of the faculty leading that direction anyhow have recently retired. Can you speak to, especially Shanna, because maybe you're got back in grad school days because Chris is here and Joe is here. What recommendations do you have for research skills, for research areas, given the heavy emphasis of Sesame Street on research? What do you recommend that people take as maybe an extra course or an elective? And then I'll ask just a quick answer, and I'll ask my deeper question.
I think courses that focus on mixed methods are really critical. Mixed methods is really critical. I'm just repeating myself, critical to the work that we do. I also think courses to understand foundations of early childhood development, to understand these developmental milestones. What are we supposed to be seeing in a 4-year-old? Again, those are culturally contextualized as well. I think I think those educational foundation courses are really important because theory comes often so much to life in the work that we do. So theories around, now this is more for our international work, but language acquisition, particularly in international context, is really, really important. Again, for even more so for preschoolers, socio-emotional development, sociocultural foundations, really those foundational courses, I think that provide that strong base for which to understand and conduct research.
And if I could just jump in to add, I so agree with you, Kurt, and our guests that formative assessment is such a critical ingredient of making any project successful. So we've always offered a course in hands-on practice in that. Most universities would have enough projects going on that would be happy to have student researchers join up in order to conduct some formative testing and actually learn the skills in the process. So that's another suggestion.
Shanna, you have anything to add?
No, I think Kim just named a lot of courses I wish I'd taken. I think that the only thing I would add, this is sort of a little bit unrelated to what we're talking about now, but I think user testing, like UX design and UX testing, is really interesting. And there are times when I wish I had background in that for what I do now.
Yeah, well, I double majored in human development and human learning at Wisconsin and minored in ed tech or media areas. It was 1988 when I was sitting in the auditorium at Wisconsin. Next to, on my left, was a professor named Veer DeVault, and he was one of the old timers ready to retire a few years after that. And we were sitting for a session from the makers of 3-2-1 Contact. And they were starting to create a new show. 3-2-1 Contact was from 1980 to 1988 as part of Sesame Street Workshop. And I don't know what the show was. It's a math show that they were designing at the time. And Veer looked at me at the end and he said, "It'll never work." And then he followed that up and he said to me, "I said the same thing about Sesame Street 20 years ago. And I was wrong then, and I'm probably wrong now." So I wonder if each of the three of you could speak to in what ways was Veer wrong, or the opposite. What are some principles or some aspects of Sesame Street, 3-2-1 Contact, and other things that make it successful, that proved him to be wrong? Do you have anything you want to spotlight there?
Well, I certainly do, but I should let the folks who actually make the things happen go first. Sean, you want to go first this time?
Sure. Well, so I'll give the non-research based answer, semi-research based answer. And then Kim can back me up, hopefully. But I think the sort of intangible thing to me that makes Sesame Street really special and successful is the Muppets. And the reason for that is I think kids really see the Muppets as other kids. But and Kim has done a lot of research on this in the past year as well. Like they're seeing them as other kids, but to each kid, they're the kid they want to be talking to because they're sort of amorphous in what they are, and their race and their gender, and even humanity. So I think it's that, and I think that opens the door for us to talk about things that are really tough to talk about as humans to one another, and then to model for parents how to talk about those things too. So to me, that's like the heart of what we do.
I totally agree. It's those, there's work on this, on the importance of parasocial relationships. And I think the more that we have expanded our work into, the US is an incredibly diverse context. Where we work across the globe is very diverse. Shanna was mentioning Ahlan Simsim, our show that's designed for children affected by conflict in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. Incredibly diverse context. Our goal is, no matter where a child is coming from, what their background is, the challenges that they're facing, they see themselves in some element of our character. And that's really, really important, because we know from the research that when I connect, I see myself, these are my friends, the learning, it makes the learning possible. Without that, right, you're disconnected. And you think even, the 7 of us watching TV, oh, I could totally be friends with those people. We think those are adults, and that drives our engagement too. This is very much the same with Sesame. And it goes back to, that's the heart of what makes Sesame. It's the learning is always going to be there. The Muppets are always going to be there. It's what gives us the heart and the joy. Ultimately, when we want families, when they walk away from our show, of course, we want them to have learned something. We want them to have felt really good. And that's where our show comes from, an asset model. We don't approach childhood development from a deficit model, even when we're dealing with really, really tough topics like addiction, incarcerated parents, children affected by conflict. It's always approaching it from a place of love and joy and really building upon that asset model. And I think that's what makes Sesame so successful for as many years as it's been.
That's such a generative question. This is great. I really enjoyed what both Sean and Kim had to say, and it's not at all what I would say. So I'll just jump in as well, because I have a sort of structural view of why Sesame products are so successful. It comes down to three things. One is you're seeing research and education. You're not seeing production, but that's also the other key element of the workshop. Those people are there every day working together, and it builds a kind of trust where the producers, the research, they believe the curriculum, and the researchers and the educators know that what they have to do is support production, because that's what goes out into the world. So that bond of trust built among people who aren't consultants, who don't come in for just a couple of days a year on one series, but who work there all the time. I think that's a key structural element. I think a second is continuous experimentation. I mean, there's some aspects of Sesame Street today which look familiar from 50 years ago, but there are others that are really new and different. And every season of Sesame Street is viewed in some sense as an experimental season. So I think the commitment to continuous innovation, not just resting on laurels, which is what happens a lot in other media. And the third thing I would say is brand consistency, so that parents know they can trust. So when Sesame tries something, adventurous or challenging, parents are open to giving it a shot because they believe in the brand. And part of that's been built by Sesame trying things that they never showed to the public, because testing revealed that it was not going to be good for kids, good for families. And so they put all that money and threw it away because it wasn't going to support the brand. So those are three kind of structural elements that I think are underlie the success.
Wow, that was a really great answer, Joe.
Can I ask a quick follow-up, Joe?
I think Joe should have gone first.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. That was a great answer. Yeah, all three of you. Excellent.
No, absolutely. The other pieces are critical. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So, Joe, thanks for bringing up the sort of the system and the process, and because I was really curious about how at some level you can do this research on child development and what parents were, all that. But then at some point, what makes Sesame unique is the move to the creative aspect. And I'm sure there is, anybody who's done anything like a film or a book, which is informational and entertaining at the same time, there is this fundamental tensions there. And I think that's where lot of the sort of the breakage happens, is where the best of intentions of education become difficult to map onto entertainment, right? And I think Sesame Street manages to do that like really well. And I wonder because there has to be some kind of a process which allows for the work that you guys do to go to the creatives and find that sweet spot. And I wonder how you guys work through that, because I can see that as being the point where there is going to be all of the best intentions can just fall on the wayside. And we see a lot of examples of those in a variety of contexts, right? So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I was thinking of the tensions as Joe was giving his first note. The tension is what makes it good, is that the tension has to be there for us to push each other. There are times where Shanna and I don't agree, or I don't agree with production, or Shanna doesn't agree with production, right? That is always happening. And I think a few recent documentaries have come out about Sesame that have highlighted that tension as well. It's always been there, and I hope it never goes away, because that's where that creative work happens. I think it's a little bit different for me than it is for Shanna. So I definitely want Shanna to talk about it, because from formative especially, we present research findings on scripts that production has written. So these are artists creating, and we're now telling them, well, yeah, that was really interesting and funny, but kids didn't get it. And here's why we think they didn't get it. So here are all the changes that we're suggesting that you make. And so that's inherently uncomfortable, right? When you're telling an artist that they need to make changes to their art. So there's a negotiation there, particularly between research and production, where we're working with them to understand their point of view, how they're working to meet these educational outcomes, and then how we can give them concise, actionable, creative pathways to implement some of the things that we're seeing directly from kids.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Shanna?
Thank you. I think Kim summed it up really well. I think that what I would add is that I think of my role a lot and the educator's role as a translator between research and production. So, and because I'm so deep in the weeds on scripts and I'm reviewing, so when scripts are being created, I'm reviewing every single script and saying, hey, can we throw one more educational message in there? This is really fun. And then when Kim's research comes back, I say, okay, well, here's something we could try to incorporate this. I think that what Joe said about the trust between all of us, and I think in my role, especially with production, because I trust research immediately, it's key, because I think it's important that production understand how much I respect the creative process. And I think all of us at Sesame have an understanding that if kids aren't engaged, doesn't matter how great that educational message is, Joan Gans Cooney said, if you can't reach them, you can't teach them. And to us, the reaching them is the getting them to laugh and getting them to keep their eyes on the screen and pay attention and be engaged and excited to watch the content. So it's just everything I communicate to production is through the lens that I have deep respect for the creative process.
Thank you. And I want to just go back to something, Kim, you mentioned in the beginning, which I think you did, which is around sort of the core values. And I think in an organization of this nature with two very different perspectives, approaches there of the research and the production, the artistic production, that having that shared values and trust and communication, I think is absolutely essential. It wouldn't happen without that. So thank you. Zhao, I know you've been waiting. I'm sorry I jumped in there.
No, I think, Joe, you have something to add to that?
Just a footnote to what Kim and Sean said, because I think it's so fascinating to Punya's point, and that is that whenever Sesame is in the studio actually taping the episodes, there's somebody from education sitting in the control room. And as the creatives might depart from the script because they have an idea about something that's really funnier or cooler to do, there's a person there to make sure that the curriculum point doesn't get lost. I think that really dramatizes the commitment to the future of entertainment and education that makes it work. Now, thank you, Sal. On to you.
Well, I just want to come in to say this. First of all, I'm probably the only one here in this audience who never saw Sesame Street when I was a child. I was born and raised in a village in China. We did not have TV, anything. So my Sesame Street experience was through my children who grew up in the U.S. But another action, I want to really say that you guys are not lying, because I knew when I was helping Sesame Street to move to China, you sent action researchers there. We were trying to do stuff, so. But that's not really my real point. My actual question has to do with this is that out of all these years, remember when Joe said 1968, you did not even have a PBS network. Now you have PBS. Now you have Disney. Now you have Nickelodeon. Now you have now Netflix. Now you have all this new media. So mass media is really become more personalized in many ways. And, of course, Disney Junior can claim, we have surpassed PBS by ranking, in some ways. So I was just wondering if you can share with us, this also includes international. So the competition is so high. And of course, you have iPads, you have iPhone. I mean, you know what I'm talking about is that all this new media popping up. and people's consumption, I'm sure habits change, and parents' view change, and also you're dealing with new issues. For example, racial issues, LGBTQ issues, and because these are all facing school district putting their books out. So it's we live in a very strange time, by the way. So I was just wondering, from Joe, from Kim, and from Shanna, just how does Sesame negotiate all this competition? Some may be right, some may be wrong. So all these things, just anything you guys can share, I think would help us to think about how do you keep a miracle going for over 40 years, 50 years, maybe another 100 years. My grandchildren, I don't have any, but if they do, they might still be watching Sesame Street. So anything you guys share will be great.
This is a question, this is a great question, and one that we're really trying to figure out the answer to. My counterpart, we have a large market research team as well, who explores media engagement and viewing consumption across a variety of platforms. YouTube is the #1 platform for watching media around the world. And so that is a very different viewing experience than tuning in at 9 a.m. on Monday through Friday to watch your favorite show, because there's a difference in viewing engagement with the length of content that's viewed, the control, as you were talking about. It's a much more personalized, individualized experience. In addition to, it makes co-viewing very difficult too, because we know from the research how important parental co-viewing is. And so when a child is watching on a mobile phone, the chance for co-viewing is much less. And so that also challenges our ability to have impact. These are all questions that we're trying to answer too through research. We really want to understand, how does engagement with children's media differ from YouTube or any other digital platform? And what does that mean for impact? These are all questions that I'm hoping that we can answer in the next couple of years. How does a different viewing experience change dose, for example? What is the minimum dose threshold? How many minutes of content does a child need to watch in order to get a measurable effect in terms of supporting their learning across emotional identification, for example? This is a long-winded way of saying these are all questions that we're trying to explore that we don't yet have answers for.
I have an answer, but I won't give
Oh,
you.
good. Oh, great.
I don't. Actually, I was waiting for Joe or Shanna to jump in.
Well, you mentioned your question, really two tensions facing the workshop. One is the competition for screens and eye time, and the other is new challenges, issues that we're dealing with. And I think it's important on the second one to note that Sesame's been pretty bold, actually, in talking about things like race, gender identity, and so on, both on the show, on Sesame Street itself, and through specials that get a lot of attention. And through another format, which I think is really particularly interesting, which is, because I'm trying to focus on elements of innovation, which I think is one of the, part of the DNA of Silver Lining. I think one of the really innovative things that Sesame's done in the last 2 years is join up with CNN cable network to do these town hall presentations, which are very carefully crafted so they can be watched by whole families. They have information for little kids and also for adults. They have Muppets, but also experts in things like social justice, racial understanding, in infectious disease for the pandemic episode, and so on. So those are some of the ways that I think they're trying to respond to the contentious times that we live in, not at all turning their backs to it. Shanna, you want in on this as well?
Yeah, I'm glad that Kim answered the computing devices question, because I truly don't know the answer to that question. I think on the other end of the spectrum, when we're working in really hard to reach contexts and international contexts, I do think there are some nuts that we've cracked around in a really low tech atmosphere, using battery powered Pico projectors to project video content in refugee camps, or in India, we outfitted vegetable carts with television sets and rolled them through the streets, and kids would come and watch. And I think there's probably more technology like that we can explore, but I just don't want to forget about that low tech side of the spectrum as well.
So I grew up in America, and I'm so old that I grew up with children's programming before Sesame Street. And it really was a dark ages. I grew up with Andy's Gang, and Andy Devine was Roy Rogers' sidekick in this television show. Very nice guy, kind of a bumbling but affable uncle figure. And there was a puppet in Andy's Gang, and it was a frog. But it was a malefic sprite, I guess is the best way that I would describe it. Magic Froggy, specialized in making adults angry and frustrated. And if you want to see Magic Froggy in action, you can find Magic Froggy on YouTube with some episodes of Andy's Gang. I loved Magic Froggy because every time I was angry at my parents, here was this wonderful Magic Froggy figure, this antisocial sprite, modeling probably exactly the wrong things, but popular because it drew on sort of the dark side. There was Captain Kangaroo, which was fine, but very bland, kind of. I hope I'm not treading on sacred ground, but certainly not educational in the sense of something like Sesame Street. Captain
Kangaroo. I love Captain Kangaroo, and I was a couple miles away from you. I was much younger.
Captain Kangaroo was a nice person, but not really that educational. And it reminds me of what I hear about daycares where their kids are watching Gilligan's Island. Really. So I think it's terrific. What a leap forward this was. And at the time, a risky leap forward. Joe and I have talked about this, that it was quite controversial to do this. But I think that a big part of any learning experience is modeling. It's not what you say, it's what you do. And of course, Sesame is well aware of this, and there's a lot of modeling that goes on in the show. And if you view the Muppets as like another child, then of course that modeling speaks directly to children in terms of how to handle different kinds of situations. But childhood now is so much more complicated than it was when I was a child. And we've talked about that, but I think it's really more complicated. And in a sense, the modeling is most valuable if the setting reflects the complexity of the real world of children. And I think that's a tension, because in a sense, part of Sesame is the familiarity and the fact that it's a safe space that you come to and you kind of know what's going to happen. And that's reassuring for children who have very chaotic lives. But at the same time, if you want to model, then some of that chaos has to come in, I think, in order to demonstrate how you handle chaos. And I don't know whether what I'm saying makes sense to you at all within the Sesame DNA, but I'm curious as to your thoughts about this issue.
Shanna, do you want to take? I feel like this is very much for you.
Yeah, I can start. I'm sure you have research stories around this. There's one that comes to mind that it's a research story from the domestic team that I've just heard over and over again and seen an example of, which is there was an episode they tested where Telly Monster and someone get in an argument, they're really frustrated, and Telly Monster has a dream of getting in a fist fight. The dream plays out all the way to where they're both in hospital beds and they're both all beat up and neither of them can move, and he decides, okay, that's not the best course of action, and he ends up apologizing and doing really responsible conflict resolution in real life. when they tested that episode with kids, all they remembered was Telly beat someone up and it was really funny. And so that's the story in my head whenever we're thinking about modeling. You can model negative behavior, especially if on the course to teaching positive behavior. But if it's the funniest or most interesting part of the episode, that's what kids are going to hang on to. So we're constantly thinking about where the moments of humor live and how we can make sure that they're not intertwined with the negative modeling. So I always think of also, like, for me, for some reason, all of the TV I watched as a kid besides Sesame Street and besides PBS there was a lot of violence as humor, like a lot of slapstick. And as a child, that's what I remember most. So, I know from personal experience as well as the research.
That's such a great example, Shanna. And it's still one of the most popular children's show around the world is Tom and Jerry still, for so many of these same reasons. Because, well, one, it travels easily because it's nonverbal, so you don't have to dub anything. But because it's slapstick and, the traditional cat and mouse. And so that's still very much dominating children's media. And the way that we address these things is really through formative. As Shanna was mentioning, the way that was found out about children, the stickiness of the negative behavior is through formative. And so that's always something too, where I think Shanna's team leads and my team supports when we're reading scripts, how to balance that, because there has to be funny, right? We cannot sacrifice the funny, because again, going back to the heart and the joy, kids will absolutely take away the funny negative behavior. That's what they'll remember. That's the only thing that they're going to remember. And so another example, I was thinking of Shanna was giving hers, when there was an episode on, I think the topic was cheese and circles, or I can't remember exactly, I'm not telling it precisely, but the moon was made of cheese, but it was to teach circles, and the kids took away, rather than a circle, and the moon is made of cheese, because that's funny. And that was not the intention, obviously, of the takeaway. But in terms of also of sort of the chaos of children's lives and how that is represented in the show, Sesame, there's this metaphor that we want it to be both a door, a mirror, and a window. We want it to reflect children's lives, but we want it to also be aspirational to a certain extent. And so the chaos typically doesn't make it into the show in terms of if that's going to be sort of a dominant theme. There are ways that it comes out. The show that Shanna leads on education, for example, Jod, he is from somewhere else. The show is designed to support children affected by conflict, particularly those who are displaced and refugees. So Jod represents children who have had to leave their home, but we never explicitly say that Jod is a refugee, for lots of different reasons that would take probably the entirety of this hour. But that's a way that we sesamatize some of the chaos around children's lives, that we make it developmentally appropriate, because it has to be representative so that, again, children see themselves, but it cannot be at the risk of the education, the joy, or the heart of what we do.
And Chris, the core point I think that you were making about how powerful modeling is, and then you link that to showing reality, is actually something that I think research shows affects all kinds of presentations. My favorite example, I bet all of you have seen one of these, is a show or a video designed to help kids get more excited about math. And math videos so often begin with the presenter saying, I hate math. It's so hard. It's so terrible. And then, you work your way around to say, but it's all useful and interesting. And kids remember, oh, he hates math too. So, you really have to be very careful about any modeling, any negative thing, if you are trying to go in a different direction. I think there's some questions from our guests also that we want to get to. Young, do you have those or
Yeah, I have those, Joe. So, but here's what we got. Only 10 minutes. You guys are so good. This round is for another 5 hours, so we can do that. But anyway, we won't do that. So I have a question which we may never get answered, but I want to raise that question. If it's possible, we might answer that. Is it because in education, as Joe, I mean, all of you know, we always talk about if we had to this children, to this technology, to this everything, would we build schools the same way? We always try to think about that. So my question is that if we were building, today is 1968, if that were 19, so what show would we build? Or would we build the same thing? Would we build something different? But that's not my question. That's my question. I'm sorry. I'm supposed to ask the audience question. The audience raised much better questions than I do. So the real question is from Alexandra asked, I got several. This is written for Kim. Could you say more about parent-facing work? What form does that take? Kim.
Yeah, that's a great question. So parent-facing content takes a lot of the same mediums that child-facing does. We make video content, we make a lot of print materials. We don't necessarily approach parent-facing content in the same way for lots of different reasons, right? Developmental milestones are a little bit different for adults. What we focus on in terms of parent-facing messaging, it's largely to give them the language, the tools, and the confidence to support their child's development around X, Y, and Z. So whether it's video content or print materials or trainings and this is largely what Shanna leads, that's how that messaging works. Interestingly enough, what we have found recently through our work in the Middle East is that we've never really known what's the right mix of Muppets with parent-facing content, because there is an assumption that if they see Muppets, if parents see Muppets, they'll think it's for kids. And so we tested that assumption, and what we actually found is that parents want Muppets too. Adults like Muppets. They like content with Muppets. If you've ever been around a Muppet, you'll find that you revert back to your preschool self. It happens. I think Shanna and I could tell you that it doesn't ever get old to be around a Muppet. So what we have found is that for parent-facing content, particularly video content, we have a combination of science-backed messaging delivered by an expert that's then modeled informally through a Muppet scene. And parents really value that application in a formal way, because then it helps them know how to apply that language with their children. I think I probably extended that question a little bit more than it was originally intended. I hope that.
Well, that's good. Thank you.
Okay.
Because I need to rush to some of even some other great questions. This is from Junior Rose. She really asked two questions. Is that I was wondering, is there a typical period in which new Muppets are adopted by viewers? If so, how do you know? As well as a follow-up, so do you just, what type of research you do? Yeah, look at if children model the Muppet, how to, or watch the segments with the Muppet. So any one of you can answer that question.
We do in our formative, that's one of our metrics. Are they mimicking the behaviors of the Muppet that they're watching? So that's one important indicator, more broadly for engagement, not necessarily specific to a Muppet, but we also ask kids, who's your favorite Muppet? Why? We ask parents the same questions too. And we don't have an adoption period, but what we tend to see is that Muppets with clearly defined personalities and personality traits, kids connect to immediately. So one of our Muppets that Shanna helped create, Basma, in our Ahlan Simsim, she is a star. And kids have, in season 1, kids really gravitated to her because she has a strong personality. She is funny, she is quirky, and she's a good friend, and they identify with her very, very quickly. So it's more the traits that we promote rather than a time period.
And Kim, can you just say something very quickly about reaction to Julia, the Muppet with who's on the autistic spectrum? Because I think that's the other part of that question is how kids relate to Muppets who aren't just like them.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so Julia, for our US-based work, has autism, and she was designed both for our social impact work as well as for the television show. And that was largely to help children develop the skills to identify adaptation for play, inclusion for play, and develop the language when they see someone who is different from them, and to celebrate differences. On the flip of that, it's also to help parents who have children with autism, parents whose children have friends with autism, have sort of that modeling of that behavior and language. We have found really, really strong connections with families in the US with Julia. And also now I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say specifics, but many of our international co-productions have also expressed a lot of interest in having Julia come to their show as well, because autism challenges around autism in terms of, that came out wrong, supporting children with autism and supporting children who have friends with autism is now certainly a global thought.
And very quickly, and Shanna, you might say a word in terms of this question of kids responding to Muppets. The testing for the Rohingya Muppets and all the detail you went into about appearance is just so interesting. Do you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, Kim can speak to the results more specifically than I can, but from the design side, for the Rohingya Muppets, for Afghan Muppets, for a lot of these culturally specific Muppets who are a little different than Elmer or Grover because they have culturally representative outfits. They're a little more humanoid. Sometimes they have human skin tones. We really make sure that kids are, like Kim said, seeing themselves and their culture represented. And so in a situation like Afghanistan, where there are multiple cultures within a culture, it's this dance to make sure that there are culturally specific elements of dress for each ethnic group, so that each one feels, oh, there's a part of me in this, versus, oh, she's definitely this ethnicity or this ethnicity. And Kim can add to that too for the Rohingya Muppets.
So, Young, you said 5 hours, and I'm not doing anything for Saturday night, so I'm happy to stay, but I'm not sure everybody else will be. But I guess what I want to say is that one of the reasons I feel so privileged to be able to work with these folks and to study Sesame Workshop is that it does feel like a laboratory for thinking about the most challenging problems that children face in the 21st century. And not just thinking about, but acting on, trying things, learning from failures as well as from success, and constantly being ambitious. And I think those things are things which you ask about, how would these insights apply to school? I think those are things that schools should be doing more of, rather than trying to replicate with excellence what's already been done. Being ambitious about what hasn't been done, trying things, learning from failure are things that I think would really improve the schooling experience for everyone. So with that little bit of sermonizing, I'm going to say, turn it back to Chris and say thank you all so much for having us here. We've really been delighted to have this conversation.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being guest experts on the show. We celebrate a lot of innovations across the world and ask questions, often probing questions, about how it's designed and why it works. It's very seldom that we get answers as deep and thoughtful as we have gotten from you. I mean, there truly is half a century of thought represented here and some very deep insights, and it's exciting. And I think also the dialogue has helped people who may be thinking about media and children to see this as a model and to think about some of the kinds of themes and issues that Sesame is confronted, that if they do something different with children but use media, that they should also be thinking about and wrestling with. So we really want to thank you for this, and it's truly exciting to see this going on. We're going to keep on cranking out episodes. I don't think we'll get to Sesame's total, but it's an aspirational goal for us to think about. Could we come out with that many episodes of Silver Lining for Learning? Yong, you want to talk about next week?
Sure. I just want to also thank you, Joe, Kim, and Shanna. I mean, it is truly, really wonderful that you can come to share the stories and your thoughts about Sesame. I just want to have another thing. I think we might have confused Joe because Punya calls me Zhao and the rest of us calls me Yong. That's just the Sesame tension. You know, we want you to, you can call me first name or last. That's the Sesame kind of thing. Both works. Okay. But anyway, our next episode, at the suggestion of Christidi, we'll have invited guests from Finland and from the National Center for Education and the Economy and for Singapore, because they've been running a program for 3 years. That's about the high-performing education systems based on PISA. Which I personally not a big fan, but you know, since they use PISA, they must mean something. So they have 5 countries that's part of this meeting, and they've been discussing about the future of education. And take a look at our website. There is the reports. We have Tony McKay, Fueva Olipika, and Chair Wei Sin from Singapore and Finland. So we'll have a great conversation next week. Thank you.
And what time? What time next week?
Oh, I'm sorry, God. That the time is very strange. The time would be 5:30 my time, Pacific time, and 8:30 Eastern time. Thank you.
In the morning. Right?
In the morning. I'm sorry.
In the morning. So
in the morning.
So
Exactly.
tune in at a very different time than usual. Or
we have to have
watch,
people from Europe, from Asia, from Australia, from the US. So it's going to be a very, very interesting show. Okay, very good time. Thanks,
the
Chris.
sun never sets on Silver Lining for Learning.